Angela Wilcox, Carla Diaz, Betsy Laura Hall, and Carol Francis Lung. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking part in what I hope will be a stimulating and informative discussion.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
We are hoping that this will be less of a straight Q&A, which could get unwieldy with so many people, and more of a sort of round table. And so please, we definitely have some questions, but feel free to inject yourself at any time to talk to each other, ask questions of each other. Really, you should feel free to hijack the agenda in any way you see fit.
Hijack the agenda. I like that.
So the first thing I'd like to do is we could sort of figuratively go around the table, and if each of you could just give a little sort of synopsized bio, and also maybe saying what would be sort of most essential to understanding your practice, your artistic practice. Just as one of the reasons I want to go into it this way is because we did an interview shortly before this with a poet, and poetry, relatively speaking, is very straightforward, especially if the person you're interviewing is basically a poet. The person writes poetry. All four of you do a variety of things that I think are a lot sort of harder to describe. So rather than me trying to pull it out of you, I'd just love for each of you to introduce yourselves and say a little bit about for you to communicate what it is essentially that you feel you do. So let's just start in the order that I said. We can start with Angela.
I knew it would be me. There's not much I can really say about what I do. I'm a drawer and painter by trade. At the moment, I'm probably better known for my social practice, which is debatable whether that's relevant now as a white female, middle-class white female. I am still, I'm just really a maker.
All right, good enough. Carla?
Yeah, hello, my name is Carla Diaz, and I am a writer and an artist and an educator. And I guess you could say my practice is multidisciplinary and multifaceted, and I like to do a lot of public engagement works, and one of them, the ones that I guess I'm most known for that have started 15 years ago, was a project called Language Studio, which started in the neighborhood here that we grew up in. And so that's something that we can definitely talk about if that comes to play. I really do, the work that I do, I guess, really engages materiality. And I like to do a lot of portraiture and tell my stories. Yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
All right, Betsy?
Hi, I'm Betsy Laura Hall, and my background is in drawing, painting, and printmaking, but I do a variety of different things. What I've been making most recently in the last few years is a lot of really large-scale collage works that incorporate sewing and paper and printmaking and painting sort of all together, sort of as a hybrid. I also teach at Cal State Fullerton, and I have a little gallery space here in Long Beach called Flux Art Space, where we have a variety of different programs. Not right at the moment, but usually we're open to the public on the weekends, and have lots of different kinds of things going on here, workshops and exhibitions and dialogues and that kind of thing.
And Carol?
So my work has to do with the globalization of the garment industry, labor histories, social justice related to contemporary labor practices. I also teach in the fashion fiber materials option of the art department at Cal State Los Angeles. And just this last March 24th, Frau did a performance in isolation where she had one audience member that she texted an image of this performance every hour. And it was her 9th commemoration of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which happened on March 25th, 1911. And currently I'm doing research about the luxury fashion industry and its connection to the spread of COVID-19.
That's well, that brings us right into the topicality of the moment, the topic du jour.
Yeah.
So, why don't we start there? With this strange time that we're living in, where there's this obvious separation between people, how do you think I'll throw this question out to anyone. Are there ways in which you think that the particular art that you do, might be specially well fitted to respond to what's going on right now?
Well, as most of you know, I have the Institute for Labor Generosity Workers in Uniforms. It's located at 3rd and Elm in downtown Long Beach. So I actually just redid my windows with a statement that says, Frau Fiber wants you to avoid coronavirus capitalism, share, care, and organize. And then it says, in solidarity from a distance. And I took some old t-shirts and made these little footprint, like 3, there's 6 feet on each shirt. So like 6 foot distance. And then also a 3 foot mark on the floor of the windows, just to remind people, because I keep having to like remind my neighbors to stay 6 feet away from me. So for me, it's through the windows. I mean, it always has been through the storefront, but in particular through the windows right now. That's the space I have to activate, much like Betsy's space downtown, I mean, on the other side of town. So that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I sort of feel like for me, it's almost still in the process of, you know, what kind of work I'm gonna be doing. I'm thinking it's in the process right now, but I feel like sometimes like there's this overwhelming kind of need to be overproductive, right? Like, oh, now we're in the house and we need to work somehow, and that somehow looks like it's something like an object or something that it could be, you know, like I am making this and this is what it's going to relate to in my artistic practice. And I feel like sometimes, like to me, just, you know, being at home and really like meditating or really having that kind of time of processing things, looking at the sun differently, looking at my garden in a different way. It's still that kind of way that I sort of approach my work. And I think that, you know, in terms of the work that I'm doing, it's like, I'm thinking about, of course, we're such in these times of scarcity that I think it's really affecting us now. But since I grew up with that such being part of not only in my living surrounding area of where I grew up in, but also being able to, as an artist, make use of what we had, because we didn't have nothing most of the time, right? We're always kind of thinking like, shoot, I only have these kind of brushes. Well, I'm just gonna make it, right? Like with whatever I have, right? If I only have this color paint, shoot, I'm just gonna make that, right? Or so I think creativity by its kind of root is in that spirit of scarcity, right? We don't have that and we can create in that space. And I think for me, it's been really kind of a great way for me to kind of reflect about that and its essentiality, how much I've been, that's such a powerful thing. I always saw it kind of as a negative thing before, like, oh, I didn't have this, or I didn't have resources to do that or whatever. But now it's such a, like I'm thriving in this kind of time because I'm like, toilet paper? Pfft, I didn't even have a toilet for a long time. You know what I mean? Like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, you know, I grew up in what we call a third world space. And I grew up in in Mexico, in a part of rural area of Mexico. And then I came here to the United States. So by that kind of immigrant culture really is in that kind of space of scarcity, you know? And I think that it's really bringing up this kind of discussions of like, oh my gosh, like all of a sudden we don't have this. Well, we haven't had that in a long time. So I think it's really important that for me as an artist, that I keep reflecting on that. I keep noticing things, and self-reflection is such a big part of that. And that's okay. I don't have to make an object. I don't have to make a big kind of event or have a big audience or engage in that way. But I think that as we're processing this, certainly that's where I'm kind of reflecting on this idea of scarcity and what it can bring. So anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a good
there's a lot there.
right?
We're
Yeah.
stretching it out. One of the things when you were talking, I got to thinking about where art comes from for all of us, and of course, there's no, just like there, you know, when there used to be that question about personality development, nature versus nurture. We all know that it's both, and I think that artistic creation, I think we'd all agree that, you know, is it come from internally or is it in response to the external world? I think we'd all agree that it's both. But I am wondering for all of you, if for any of you, if one side seems more dominant for you over the other, and that drives, you know, if for example, if you have your ideas kind of come seemingly from the vacuum or the muse, whatever, and then they get shaped by society, or vice versa. If something's going on in society and that comes inside and that gets shaped by your internal process. So I'd love to hear all of you speak to that in any order.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but like, I guess what I'm listening to the other answers to the previous question, and I'm reflecting on my process, and the way that I do things is really like slow and intuitive. So what I've been finding is that oftentimes if there's something going on in the culture, or even in an art environment, a project that I'm like, say I'm in a group show, I try to take sort of a contrary perspective. And so I tend to, like, how do I put it? I'm still processing everything that's going on. And what I'm finding that I'm doing is, rather than making art at the moment, I'm gathering information, and I'm gathering experiences. And I feel like my work has always been really abstract. And so I feel like it's going to come out later. I feel like right now, for some reason, and I've talked to a few other artists that feel similarly, is that right now I'm actually not feeling that compelled. I'm making work because that's what I do, but I'm also feeling like I need more time to just sort of be outdoors for some reason. I feel like there's this need to be in nature. I feel like some of what's going on in the current environment is such an unnatural situation that's the product of our contemporary culture and how we live our lives, with all of the dependence on mass production, mass transit. And so I'm actually right now trying to pay attention to solitary activities and sort of see that as a counterpoint to, you know, I'm used to operating this way, spending time alone in solitude, and I imagine a lot of artists are, even social practice artists. And so what I'm seeing is the culture, a lot of people are having difficulty adjusting to being alone. Whereas for me, it seems more like a natural state. I don't know if that even answers the question, but I guess right now what I'm trying to do is just pay attention to how what's going on in the world is affecting me and affecting the people in my life.
I mean, I think sorry, in answering your other question that you had, I think it's also about creating spaces, right? And these kind of public spaces as social practice artists, or what they called, social practice in terms of our, I think at least my work is, how do you create these spaces, right? Multiple spaces, and what those look like, whether they're private spaces or public spaces. So when we ran programming at its language, for like over 15 years in the organization and the studio that we had open our doors to the community here in Wilmington, it was like creating multiple spaces also in that sense. I mean, we did have events and programs and things like that, but it was also about these most of the time, and as an educator myself, and as being really interested in mentoring and being able to understand the creating these safe spaces and empowering spaces, like, it was also about how we can share relationships with either ourselves, but also with one-on-one people, who were coming, young kids and, young adults who were coming to me and asking questions or wanted to use the space. And I think for us, or at least for me in this kind of reflecting time, is about also what is that going to look like, as a public artist? How do we create these spaces for ourselves? So for instance, I just started in my backyard, maybe in this reflecting mode that I'm telling you, I just had cleaned like 5 years of ivy that had grown on my fence from my neighbors, this big old tree that had covered down into the vines, and I just couldn't see anymore. I had to, they was blocking my passage, right? So I went this morning for like 3 hours with my German shepherds, and we're like hacking away, and we cut through. And in the back of my house, I have a car that I had gotten into an accident last year, and I just hadn't had a chance to deal with it. So it's sitting there in the back. And I'm like, you know what? This is an empty space. This is a space that I think right now I can't go to the studio. I'm pretty much here at home. I need to use this space, right? So I'm actually, started to use that space, the inside of my old crashed, Honda Element, to create these spaces for myself, to create this kind of interviews and conversations with public people that, and right now it's just about my family or friends or checking in with friends. But I think to me, that was the best space right now in terms of like the public, because right now I'm at the house and it's like, my partner is here, my family, he is here. I can't have that right now, right? And honestly, as like people who are always in public and engaging in public, we can't really have that, but we are creating ourselves. And what platforms can we create, and what does those look like? And for me, even if it seems like it's just the backyard, it's a whole couple of steps away from everything, right, that I can kind of create right now. And so I think it's really important how we think as artists, as amazing, I'm sure as everybody here that looks like amazing artists, how we create our personal and public spaces. I think at the same time, maybe Betsy, that's what you were kind of thinking about, right? How these self-reflecting kind of moments can be also private and intimate spaces and public spaces.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm grateful for the connectivity we have through the internet and through, I've discovered that, there's a real need right now for dialogue. And I have no doubt that artists will find ways to respond to, like, I'm always thinking about the parameters of any given situation, with my art, like how can I work within the parameters? It doesn't seem like a problem so much as a circumstance. And so I really feel like artists in particular are pretty resourceful people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even just Carla talking about a car, I'm like, ooh, a car would be a great art space. Why not? And then if we can, somehow, I'm glad that we have the digital technology that even though we are isolated, we can connect just like we're doing today, where we can't be together in person, but we can still have a dialogue and an exchange of ideas. And so, if this is going to happen, it's a nice time for it to happen because we can still continue to work on projects, albeit in different forms.
And I have to say, yeah, exactly. And I have to say, sorry, but I'm also fulfilling this kind of fantasy, childhood fantasy, because I love the A-Team when I came here to the United States during the 80s. And that was like one of my favorite like teams, right? The A-Team and Mr. T. I always rooted for Mr. T. And so like the premise of Mr. T, I mean, and the A-Team really is these kind of underground ex-soldiers, military coup men that go and rescue the underdog, right? But they always had like this, like they always had this kind of rescuing of like people and coming together to like their garage, right? In the back of their garage. And that's where like in the back of my garage where the van is. So it's kind of like fulfilling this fantasy in a way. I mean, it's like, I don't know, but we can talk much about that, like how that kind of inspired maybe all of my crazy adventures that I have, you know?
Questions from the audience?
Yes, you, sir, in the hat and glasses.
Yes, thank you very much. So, I mean, maybe what I'm hearing here a little bit is, you know, over the last few years, sometimes my issue with social practice is it felt like it was becoming more and more sociable practice than actual social practice, with its own set of tropes and buzzwords that would get you the grant. And I felt, it was kind of becoming a little tired and maybe dying in certain ways. So, you know, this particular sort of crisis, if you will, that has now put everything topsy-turvy, turvy, sorry, English like mine, turvy, is causing us to re-examine and to not merely, you know, pay the cliche lip service, but actually look into what does it mean, where did it come from? Is that a correct observation on my part relative to maybe what all four of you are doing here? We're talking about here?
Yeah. I don't want to keep answering, but yeah, I mean,
we lost Carol for a minute. She'll be back.
She'll be back, right? Where is Carol? Oh my God, they kidnapped Carol. They ate him. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think it's really interesting because, you know, like as many of you all know, like in terms of like the discussion of like social practice has come under a lot of scrutiny, you're right, in terms, or just in terms of how do you work within those parameters, what those parameters look like when you're working with communities, right? Like, especially if, you know, it's a place or it's a collaboration that maybe you don't necessarily have never worked with that specific communities, right? Because I mean, there's multiple communities, right? That's not your own. So for instance, one of my project that I do is a prison gourmet performance. And in that performance, it started as a performance, but now it's like a multimedia installation and project and so forth. But when I started that performance as a performance at LACMA, it was like a 3-hour performance. And I started it as a personal kind of take that I wanted to have a conversation with my brother who was in prison. And so, but then it sort of opened up into these multiple communities where you know, mothers and families of the prisoners to like, you know, I even took the project to New Orleans, to all over California and so forth. But what I'm saying is that for me, it really kind of made me question this idea of not only how each time that you're working with the multiple communities, even if it's the same thematic, it's gonna be a different experience. And if people ask me like, well, is it because you're a chef and you know everything about food, or you must know everything about the food and the recipes that the inmates have, and that's why you're interested in food, and that's why you did this project? And I always say that as my work, the reason why I do the stuff that I do it for 2 reasons. One of them is because I'm curious by nature, super curious, like, you know, that's why I ask a lot of questions, because I'm super curious and I always ask a lot of questions. And 2, because I love it and I fall in love with something about this project. So if I am not part of that community, I always have to ask, well, who is part of that community? Who is part of the people that I can work with that know about this community, that are part of this community? And then I start from there. So for instance, I've never been to prison myself. I mean, thank God. I always say that I decided to go to the other institution, which was art school. So I had a choice to go to the art school or prison, right? I chose art school. So I never had that experience, thank God, in my life to go to prison. But I just think that, being able to work and understand these kinds of my role in that particular place is very important, right? So I think, Betsy, when you're talking about this idea of that, I totally agree how you're able to kind of, work with these, I'm sorry, Gregory, when you were talking about how I'm sorry, not Gregory, what was your name? I'm sorry.
Marco?
Marco,
Yeah,
the one
Marco,
you brought up that
sorry.
question. Marco, I'm sorry, Marco, when you're bringing up this question about how, working with different communities, it can be problematic, right? Because sometimes as artists, we want to work in these areas that perhaps we don't know about and that we are foreign to, and that we are coming in from a different perspective, right? And sort of, it could be really, to me, it can be a very tricky line, right? Like that we can figure out, okay, well, why are we as artists coming in to sort of engage with this particular community in a way that we are learning, in a way that we want to learn? What is it, our intentionality? So I always have to question that in my work. But that's a good point that you're bringing about, Marco. I don't know if any of the others have other thing to say.
I saw your hands go up.
I think that social practice ends up being a catch-all. When I went back to grad school as a 38-year-old adult, it was right at the time that Relational Aesthetics text by Baudrillard was written. And simultaneously, there was some talk about Joseph Beuys' social sculpture. And then this catch-all term like social practice came into play. And I think it's a lot more nuanced than that catch-all. I do recall like in 2010 to 2014, like doing graduate studio visits, like at the California College of Art with young social practice artists. And there was a lot of problems within the educational system, because I feel like for me, even though my work does get categorized as social practice, many practitioners, I think, use the public for their own benefit and to kind of further their careers, and oftentimes are not very thoughtful about the impact that they're going to have on a population of people. Suzanne Lacey's work is sometimes a perfect example of that. Well, she goes into a space as a privileged white artist to do a project in a community that she does not represent, and teaches her students to go in and like show people how to have a good life, right? And I think that's when social practice becomes really problematic, when you're assuming that, for example, people in New Orleans need to have art. So Prospect One started in New Orleans because people in New Orleans need to know what fine art looks like, because they're not creative enough already in their cultural landscape. So I think but it's also like a hierarchy of privileged art making too, that tries to go into other communities and tell them how to be creative based on the Western canon. So in my work, I try and be really mindful of that hierarchy and mindful of like my privilege, even in a position like right now where I'm able, because I have the space and the time and a paid teaching job, to start, making these surgical masks for the requests that are happening. I can do that because of my privilege as an academic and because of my privilege as an artist. And not everybody has that privilege, and I'm very aware of that.
One more thing. Because I'm thinking about audience here, and there may be a lot of, let's say, younger people who don't know necessarily what social practice is. And I would love it if each one of you could either give a definition or an example of what you do, that, you know, because so many times we'll access literature and we go, I understand all the words, but I don't understand what they're talking about. And so if each one of you could talk about social practice, what it is to you, you know, how you express it, would that work?
I don't do social practice, so I can't answer that question, Marco.
Yeah, no, but you are perceived as a social practice.
I can give you the Wikipedia definition of social practice.
And I have that too, yeah. So what is it that different, because you are perceived frequently as a social practice artist, so what differentiates you and what you do from...
What is a social practice artist? First, can we have the definition?
So the definition on Wikipedia says, is an art medium focusing on engagement through human interaction and social discourse. That's pretty all-encompassing.
Right.
I follow, what I studied and followed at the Bauhaus University in Weimar was social sculpture, which is a term that was coined by Joseph Beuys. And to me, the way that I interpret it is basically socialism engaged through art making, primarily performance-based art. So his like planting of the trees, that was something that was happening in the Eastern Bloc. That's something that the government provided to people, was to plant orchards along the roads. So Beuys kind of reenacted that action that socialism was doing and declared it to be an art practice. Of course, he was also like a performance artist, and I think the thing, like I'm an artist. My work covers a lot of different veins. Sometimes I get described as like a craft activist, which I really am not fond of, but I do consider myself a crafts person. Like I have a craft-based skill, the skill of sewing. But I make work based on how I feel I need to respond. And actually right now in my practice, there's a total retreat from public engagement happening, which started happening in January after like 14 years of hardcore work in the public realm. Like I'm pretty well saturated. But something that's really interesting that's happening is I had a gig that was supposed to happen at Bowdoin College in June to go to Bowdoin, and Frau was going to do a workshop, a Sewing Rebellion workshop, based on an artwork from their collection. Well, that's not happening. And so instead, we're working towards hosting a virtual workshop that then people from all over the country can attend in their own homes or in small gathering spaces once people can come together again, which will happen in July. And that's really exciting to think about, like, how can this idea of engaged work that happens through workshops or performances or some kind of gift economy can occur both in a physical space and in a virtual space simultaneously. Actually, I'm on this feed through the Elsewhere Collaborative, which is in Greensboro, North Carolina. And it's many people who would declare themselves to be social practice artists, and they're making a lot of puns and jokes about disengagement.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So,
Angela, you were about to interject something?
No, not at all. I was just asking what people thought of social practice.
or what it is. How do you define it, Angela?
I don't. I don't. I didn't go to school to be a social practice artist. And in fact, back in 99, I was working with people with visual impairments doing video projects. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, somehow, it's now become quote unquote social practice. I don't do this. I did this for the money. This is where the money was for me as a female artist. There is no money. Right. So ultimately, in the end, this is a way. But I don't consider myself a social practice artist. I'm an embedded artist.
But you bring up an interesting point, though, because so much of the funding is for these engaged works where you're working with a specific community. And so that's how you can generate income when you don't have a gallery.
So why does that make it social practice?
that's just what the historians and the theorists have canonized it as.
Right, I agree 100%. And what's intriguing is I've been doing this for over 20 years with no name of social practice.
Yeah.
I just worked as an artist
Right.
in certain areas. And, and I was asked to come in and work with people with visual impairments. So my job was not to go, oh gosh, I'm an artist and I'm going to create something. That was not what I was engaging in. I was engaging in how to create how they create their whatever it is, but to facilitate something that engages myself and my own art practice. Because originally I was a huge installation artist.
Right.
Right. This is just a byproduct of, where the money is. I mean, now it is what it is. Everybody's a social practice artist. You can go on PBS 21. Everybody who is anybody is now engaging in the community to do whatever they want to do. I mean, that was never, I don't consider myself a social practice artist. I consider myself an artist.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And predominantly a digital media technology artist, but I'm a drawer and painter in my foundations.
Right.
Whatever drives, whatever the community drives me to do, if
Right.
that's, I don't know.
Well, I mean, on some level, I guess, because before I went to grad school, I did community murals, throughout the state of Pennsylvania. And it was for that same reason, like a school would hire you to go in and paint a mural. And I had that skill. So I did that work and, sometimes did it through art institutions and sometimes did it through educational institutions. And, it probably was the foundation for the work that I'm doing now, in terms of experience, right along with like going to Burning Man and being a Girl Scout and going to Mardi Gras. Like all those things informed the things that I do now.
Yeah.
And working in the fashion industry for 14 years.
Yeah.
There's a social practice. I've never also thought of that term as applying to like my practice. I mean, I always thought myself also as an artist, and more than that, like just curious about life. And I think that kind of feeds, like I said before, like what I do and my work. But I mean, in terms of like what we were doing at Language and being this kind of public space, studio space, it was very interesting because it did it was sort of like a public sculpture, now that you're referring to that and that idea, but first of all, I mean, I think it was like, it had a history before its history that kind of added to the space. As any of you guys know, that maybe having a space that has multiple histories really kind of adds to that, more of the confusion of like, how do we say this is a public space? So for instance, the space that we used to be a bakery, and everybody, then after that we took it over as a studio space, and it was like, we kind of inherited the walls and the black walls of the bakery. And so people would come in and they wanted their bread, their sweet bread here being in the community. But so we inherited the stories of that space, like where people coming into, they were used to buying their bread. And then it sort of morphed into, our studio space, a multiple space of like a studio space. Then we would have DJs, then we would have exhibitions, then we would have conversations. Then it was sort of facilitating mentorship kind of gatherings for some of the community. And then it was also where we had our workshops there. But it wasn't like, let's say, oh, we were social practice artists at that time. It was like we were, we always said that what we had really, because when people would come in and see stuff on the walls, and as we were building, and as we were kind of cleaning the walls and, putting, a toilet in the restroom, because we didn't have a toilet then. It was kind of like this kind of work in progress in a way. And people would be like, is that your work? Or is that, your partner? My husband and I co-founded the space. His name is Mario Barra Jr. And they would ask us, is that your work? Or is that your work? And we say, no, you're breathing in it. This space is what is the artwork, right? This space is what it is, right? Because people, when you run a space, they want to see what you have, what you have made, you know, what kind of product you have, or what does it look like, right, that you're working on. And curators would always come to visit us, and we would always have to say to them, you know, it's not here, like, it's not here really, it's who's coming here. And so if we would have like conversations with people that were coming, like come in and join us from the street, you know, like some of the street artists that would come in and just kind of do the work there, with conversations with curators or people who were in other sorts of work. And so I think that kind of merging of that space, really, that kind of conversational space, multi kind of conversational space, it's really what social practice is, right? Where you are having these multiple conversations, multiple perspectives, multiple, you know, points of view. And to get that is really to understand where the space is in context, and also who is there, you know, with you. Who are the people that are there with you that that make up that space, you know? And I think for me, it was always about, again, that curiosity. So I would knock on doors, I would go walk around, I would, you know, be really engaged within the context of the space to see what was going on, you know, what things I could notice about this particular space. And one of them was, again, you know, not just where we were, that we were used to be a bakery, but next door to us, there was a bar on the corner. And then next, on the other side of where we were, it was a theater, an old theater, you know, one of those amazing downtown theaters that they still have, like in the downtown area. I don't know if you're familiar with, in downtown LA, they have these really historical buildings. And so this was one of the old theaters that used to have a lot of famous, you know, Mexican singers that used to come and sing all the time. And so we were sort of in the middle of like this theater and the bar. And in that beautiful theater, it was now occupied by a church, right? Like one of those Para de Sufrir churches. And so in my space, I was always like in this kind of space of, like, I used to call it between heaven and hell. You know, I was like in purgatory, right? That was that kind of social spacing where I was always between heaven and hell. And like the people that would transverse that space was always like, you know, the little mans that were drunk that would like leave the beers there. And, you know, and I would find like the church ladies, you know, walking with their kids, you know, the kind of multi mixing of that space was always so vivid that I think that was part of the work. So I think in this conversation, just hearing the other artists talk about that, it's like, I think we don't necessarily see ourselves, if we're making that kind of work, as, you know, being.
Did they tell you about the glass yet?
What?
Angela,
Sorry, it's my son.
just mute your.
Did you ask me a question? No. Okay.
No, go on. It's a son interjecting in the side comment.
Oh, hi, son, interjecting.
So maybe I could just build on what Carla was talking about, in the sense that one of the things that I was reflecting on, I think that these socially engaged practices, you know, they've been around for a long time. They built on the Fluxus movement. But when I came into it in like the early 2000s, it seemed like there was this moment where people were feeling really disconnected from traditions, whether that was traditions of sewing or knitting, like a lot of craft traditions, domestic traditions like cooking, you know, canning, these kind of craft activities, homemaking activities. And so a lot of social practice, relational aesthetics works play on cultural traditions, personal traditions, community traditions that people were feeling really like they were losing touch from. And so it's interesting to think about, like, in this time where we're being asked to isolate, we're being asked to distance, how we once again reflect on those traditions, whether it's in collaboration with the web or in collaboration with each other, through things like, I have a 5:30 appointment to play gin rummy with people from all over the country, you know, so, or the fact that I'm looking at producing a workshop that's going to occur through the internet, but also have face-to-face. So, you know, how is it going to change? How is it going to also push the canon along so we're not just stuck in this place of relational aesthetics or public practice or whatever the terms are. And I also think, like, it's not our jobs as artists to put ourselves in those boxes. That's someone else's role, and it's our role to produce the work and maybe be blissfully ignorant about how our work is being canonized, or to choose to kind of control, you know, what people are saying about our work.
Yeah. And
I kind of feel that way myself, where I have been included in groupings of people that are considered social practice artists, and I've actually never considered myself a social practice artist. So here we are again, you know. So that's kind of interesting. I make the work that I feel I need to make. I feel like I made a transition at some point along the way. I felt like just making work for people to look at wasn't enough, given what was going on in our culture. And I felt like I needed to have opportunities for people to engage with each other and with the work, and sort of create situations, sometimes even just really simple disruptions of everyday life that would cause people to think differently about their place in their culture or in the world. But I never really considered myself a social practice artist. So that's, you know, I guess it's interesting to see how people get categorized.
yeah. Yeah, I think also, like, now that we're like hearing Betsy and Angela and everybody talk about that, it's interesting also, I think, you know, when operating out of the space of language, it's like it was always, because it was always morphing, and we were always trying to support it ourselves, and they had all these other things that financially, as we know, having a space, and if we don't have, you know, that capital, right, that support, it's very hard to sustain that, right? And so at one point it was almost like, you know, we had to be really clever. We had to really be clever about how to really think about what we wanted to do in that space, and that what did we want to do if it wasn't like something, because everything that we made and the programming that we went, it was really because we did feel there was an urge to have these conversations that they were not having. And so I think at a certain point, it was almost also a responsibility to the community there, because there was such a need, you know, for instance, after a whole year that we were in existence, you know, we were using it first year just kind of as a studio space and so forth. And then the young people started coming to the space and knocking on doors, and they were like, what are you guys doing? And I would be like, well, here. Mario would be like, here's a paper, go over there to that corner and draw. And I would be like, here, over there, and go paint your dad or your mom. And so it was really like became this kind of de facto kind of school, right? And we didn't know that was a need, right? That was not, we didn't come in and be like, hey, let's start a social practice like space, right? That's not how we were really thinking about it. It was kind of like, you know, we are opening up the space, and we saw that there was one of the first art spaces, public spaces here in Wilmington, in the community. And so I think sometimes that kind of, if you are kind of receptive towards that needs or those needs, right, as artists, we can kind of respond or engage in that way critically. And I think that's how we responded. We're like, you know what? Wow, that's really interesting. So after the first year, the city of Los Angeles actually came to us and said, you know what? We have this percentage of money that has been accrued here. It's like, it was like a 10%, I think, that every kind of organization that is like a business has to give to the arts, and it had been accruing for a couple of years. Well, we have a lot of, it's a very industrialized town, as some of you guys know that are familiar with the Long Beach area here in Wilmington. It's a very labor kind of industrialized center. And so we have a lot of oil refineries, and we have, of course, the Port of Los Angeles here. So it was really interesting. The city came to us and said this money had been accruing to give to the arts, but there was nobody to give it to in Wilmington, right? And so one of the young ladies that came to the space as we were giving them tours at the beginning, you know, they came and she was interning with us, and she said, you know what? There's a space, she said to the city of Los Angeles, you know, and they said, there's a space here in Wilmington, and I think you can, you know, give them some funding. And so the city of Los Angeles and the representatives came to us and they said, you know, can you put a budget together for us so that we can fund you? And so that was really how we were able to support some of the creative endeavors and that kind of very important kind of stepping stone of like our space, and kind of shifted a little bit to like a public space, right? Versus just being the, you know, the studio space that we wanted to kind of start. But it really, we had generations of the artists here in the community that we knew, our families, our friends, that it was almost like they were waiting for this space to happen, right? Now I feel like a grandmother because I have like 2 or 3 generations of artists that have come through our space, you know, they're like, or in their creative fields. But I think it's this kind of idea of like, not just coming with, I guess it taught me really well of not coming with imposing kind of views, right, of what that would look like. I had no idea what that would look like, right? I didn't say like, oh, I'm gonna, you know, this is how this is gonna be built. This is how I'm gonna engage in this space, right? It sort of was every time we were being in the space, we continued to respond to needs. We continued to have a responsibility, I think, to some of the community there, and how we could serve that in some level. And so our kind of educational programming and things like that, anything that we did, even if we just did an exhibition or a talk, geared 3 different kind of things. One of them was about talked about contemporary art and street aesthetics. And the other one was really to really engage the community in some way. So if we would have artists, let's say that we had a guest artist that was coming from, we had a couple of artists that were coming as a residency from Puerto Rico. And so they did something with the community as a kind of engagement. Not only, you know, we were inviting people and artists and different people to do from outside of the community, but we always had to keep somebody from there that was always engaging with the artist somehow there, or the community, part of the community. So I think it's, it was just kind of making me think about how, as artists, we're navigating these kind of worlds of officiality all the time and unofficiality, right? Like we're always opening this kind of discussions of like, I think Angela or somebody else mentioned about this idea of like, why is it all the money going out towards these kind of social practice programs? Well, the idea is that now it became official. They had to have an official title to it, right? To be able to have money and to kind of say, okay, it's institutionalized now. It's like anything about like, you know, when it's like, I think with what we do, it's like things that we see on the streets, right? Or things, street aesthetics, or things that we like, and that we're like, oh, that's so cool, that's so underground, right? Or you can think of any movement, right, that at first was very underground, or punk, or whatever it was that was like really underground. And then it became like the norm, or it had a title and became institutionalized. So I think it's really interesting how that's become that. And it does come to question like, well, do we have to be institutionalized? Do we have to have that to have capital, right? To keep reproducing, to keep supporting that artist? Does it always work that way? Or can we find alternative ways of supporting that practice that I think is essential if we're interested in continuing to be in that, or to make work that is relevant to a specific social practice, right? So anyway, sorry I'm talking a lot, you guys. I just feel like, I mean, I don't know if that's if that makes sense.
That's the idea here. That is the idea.
Okay.
You're good.
Okay, wait a minute. I lost you all.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Where did I lose you all?
We still have you.
We still have you.
Can you see me?
Yeah.
Yep.
You can see me?
Yes.
Yeah.
can't see you. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. Can you see over here what I'm doing? Okay.
Yeah.
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 I can't see you, but okay.
Carla, look in the bottom left of your screen.
All right.
There should be like a little icon for a video. Does it have a red bar across it by any chance?
There you are. Hi, I'm back. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, it was like, for me, also learning about, learning about the work that I like to do with engaging different communities. I've learned a lot just by the mere practice of doing work and educational kind of programming and exhibitions in other countries. And I remember going and doing this project in Colombia, in Medellin, in 2011. And I learned a lot about not only, you know, what the idea of social practice was, sort of in that sense that we bracketed with that was meaning, but also like the possibilities of what art can really do in spaces and create kind of this impact. For instance, in Colombia and Medellin, as you all know, it was one of the hardest, like the epicenters of a lot of drug cartels and a lot of violence for a long time, for a couple of years. If you recall that, I mean, especially like when all the drug lords were being taken out. And I was on a tour of like, I don't know why they were taking me, in exhibition securities were taking me to like the most violent places in the world, right? I had just gone to like the border of like Mexico and in Texas, you know, and then they had asked me to do this. And so when I went to Colombia, it was like before, the couple of years before, it had been worn, torn, right? Like people and families were dying. And the interaction of social public space, like it's kind of reminding me of this idea right now, because it was executed by officials that there was a curfew time, like people and mothers could only do like market runs, like the families and children could only go like certain times for school. Like, I mean, nobody was on the streets. There were all kind of military soldiers on the street. Like it was very restricted, this kind of social kind of distancing, right? But what started to happen is that the government started to really give their money and really support them by giving a lot of money to the arts, and how that would impact the most devastated kind of communities that were allocated in the where the drugs were being the epicenters of all these drug lords. And it was more the most poor communities in Colombia and Medellin. And so they built this kind of infrastructure of these centers, and from these communities there, to do these community centers and bring the arts. And it was amazing, the transformation of like what that looked like. I mean, it was like they were the neighborhood that I was working in was called Moravia, which was called the trash dump site of the neighborhood there in Moravia and Medellin. In the 1930s and 40s, it was like the trash dump site. So there was a lot of like, kind of like the favelas in Brazil. It was all these hills of trash, right? And so around that, the neighborhood started kind of building and merging and building on top of that. And so the city came and sort of said, you know, we need to kind of bring, because it was being sort of a health issue for the families and the kids being born and so forth. And so they said, we need to bring arts and artists to work with these communities. So it was like, it took about like maybe like 15 or 18 years to actually just then begin to see these kind of like evident, you know, visual kind of impact, you know, where they were like, the communities were building gardens, and they were like bringing reliable kind of sources of like work and so forth. And I mean, I can go on and on about it, but what really kind of impacted me was this idea of like, how in a most devastating kind of place, in a place that has been like a violent, torn, you know, really military kind of, nobody there, nobody comes together, there's no interactions, there's no social kind of, you know, interaction among peoples to kind of combat the violence. How can art and how can us as artists and art bring about this change? And it was such a beautiful, powerful thing for me that I got out of it. So I think in these kind of moments when we're, you know, as creative thinkers, as we think of our own practice, of course, we think ourselves as what we're making and what we're doing. But I think there's the possibilities of that, right? Like how there is such possible things like in Medellin that nobody thought would ever change, in terms of even the devastation of like families being torn from like people that were dying, their families were dying and being killed, drive-by shootings that were happening, right? It was so evident of the drive-by shootings that they actually instituted these kind of sculptural kind of islands in the middle of like the malls and like the little infrastructures of the city, so that the motorcycles would like not drive through and then shoot people and then leave. It was like would actually be stopped. So it was like that kind of evident kind of impact. It's like you really have to, I really learned a lot, you know, in terms of like these possibilities of what that could look like here in the United States. And as a kind of educator and learner and curious about the world and the how not only I'm living in this world, but how my family, my friends, the future generations are going to live in this world. It's always so important for me, you know, to think about that.
I guess, go ahead.
No, please, no, go ahead, please.
Well, I guess I was just reflecting on how challenging it can be for me when I'm addressing an issue. I tend to address things, like I've mentioned before, in a pretty abstract way, and I'm usually referencing environmental issues or socio-political issues, but more environmental issues for me personally. But the challenge that I always have is how to address the topic without being overly didactic or becoming sort of like a, I mean, one of the things that drew me to Carol's work, actually, when I first was introduced to Carol was, you know, how she was able to address really topics of global import, but doing it in a way that was aesthetic, in addition to being informative and engaging. And so it's a tricky balance for me to find ways, like when I'm addressing a particular topic, for me personally, I usually have to go 3 or 4 steps back before I go forward, because I don't want to hit people over the head with my ideas. I want people to come to their own conclusions. So I'm usually more just presenting information and allowing the viewer to, you know, draw their own ideas and inspiration from that. But I have seen that Carol was doing a project in Haiti that I thought was particularly skillful. And I also met her through an artist named Edith Abeda, who's also done a lot of really amazing social engagement activities. And she's doing an ongoing project in Pittsburgh right now that started as a 1-year artist residency and has become like an entire community project that continues on to this day, called Art Excursions Unlimited. So it's interesting to me also because I tend to be really pretty shy. So my engagement with people is usually more subtle. And with some steps of remove in between. So I really admire people that are doing a lot of face-to-face work and actually going to sites of conflict or going to sites of emergency need and making art in that way. I was wondering, Carol, would you mind talking a little bit about the Haiti project?
Well, that was the Made in Haiti project was an invitation to attend the first Ghetto Biennale in Port-au-Prince, which was curated by Andre Eugène and Leah Gordon. Leah is a British photographer, curator, and Andre Eugène is one of several artists that are part of the Artist Resistance that reside in the Grand Rue of Port-au-Prince. And they came up with this idea, and it grew out of the guys having invitations for exhibitions in the United States and in the UK and like in Canada, and their work being allowed to travel, but they were denied visas over and over and over again, because they're primarily single Black men from a poor country wanting to go to the West. And so they decided to host this first Ghetto Biennale, which ended up being actually quite a few socially engaged artists. And I was invited and created a project called Made in Haiti. And it was really hard to like do that work, knowing I was plopping myself into an environment that I was unfamiliar with, and being very aware of my privilege and my whiteness. And I did tons of reading. I read a book called Small is Beautiful, Economics as a People Mattered. I read all of Zora Neale Thurston's books. I read a bunch of books on the Haitian Revolution, and did a lot of research about the Clintons' investment and love of Haiti, which really doesn't, they may love it, but they haven't really helped the country that much. But anyway, and ended up doing this work where I was introduced to a Haitian tailor, and we use the secondhand clothing that the West dumps on countries in Africa and in Haiti that has decimated their local tailors, craftspeople's jobs, ability to earn a living, and upcycled the clothing and made it into products that then I schlepped through several trips in luggage, and would do, every time I got asked to do an exhibition, I would host a pop-up for Made in Haiti instead, and would offer these objects up for sale. And then the money would go back to the tailor in Haiti. And it did turn into like my own personal aid project. I probably invested about $20,000 over a 3-year period in that work, like supporting it and then supporting the tailor. We were also invited by the artist Theaster Gates to do a limited edition of collection of potters, aprons, and serving robes, which we did for him. And then he proceeded to appropriate that project and try and do it himself, which was an interesting moment in the history of that work, where he got a creative capital grant to go to Haiti and do Made in Haiti basically, but under his own idea.
No.
But actually the community that was familiar with the project called him out on it. And there was, so he never did it. He never realized that work, which I'm kind of happy about. Although I always wanted the money. I called him up and asked him for it once.
Yeah.
I was like, can I just have the money since you don't really need it? Like, I'll invest it in Haiti, but he never called me back. So anyway, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting work, this publicly engaged activity. I mean, I ended up meeting my husband while I was there. So it also puts us in precarious, interesting situations that change our lives forever.
Considering that we're doing this interview on the last day of Women's History Month, and that I've got the opportunity here of 4 female artists, I didn't want to let this go by without asking a question related to that. The fact that all 4 of you in your biographical material and describing yourself that you have an interest in women's issues is, of course, not remarkable. I would think that any, in this world of inequality that we live in, that any intelligent women and artist or not would be interested in that. But I did note, I was struck by a commonality, seeing words like guerrilla with a U, soft power, subversion. Carla has a quote, uncongenial to an increasingly conservative art establishment. So I'd really be interested to hear the ways, and I'd like to actually start with you, Angela, so we haven't heard from you in a while, the ways in which you feel that applying your practice in these sort of subversive ways, and how subversion and how soft power and how guerrilla tactics may be useful to contribute to artistic contributions to bring about a more equitable, gender equitable world?
Why me? I listening to everybody talk is really interesting, because I actually don't claim my artwork when I am out in public as my artwork. What's really important for me is to leave a residue or some sort of sustainability to whatever project that I do. And it's not for me to decide what the residue or sustainable practice might come from whatever I do. So it's, to sort of claim yourself, or to claim myself or my guerrilla artwork as some sort of art practice, I don't even necessarily claim that as making any difference. For me, at the moment, the most important thing is if I can connect and bring a little something, and it sounds really trite, but I'm not interested in the grand scheme of anything. What I'm interested in is if I engage with someone and with my, whatever the guerrilla style is, somebody just says thank you, and from that, because I think basically life's pretty shitty for most people. And I think that our human connections are much more important than what I'm attempting to do with my practice. And all my practice is attempting to do is to connect on a personal level. And it's very self-absorbed. But it's not self-absorbed in that I'm creating some sort of grand scheme of anything. In fact, most of my projects that I, or most of the work I do, I just give away. I paint portraits and I give them away. And it's sort of very prosaic, and it's very non-dominant. It's just very much a human to human. And so for me, as a woman in the arts, I've managed to raise, as a single mother, raise 2 kids by myself with no help from family or friend, basically friends, but no family or anything like that. And the arts has been very good to me. And I think that art is a way of sustaining culture, and it's a way of bringing some sort of stopping point where people can just be okay with where they're sitting on a bus and stuff like that. So I don't know that it answers the question, but I was just really listening to everybody talk and how, important it is to make their projects known or get to be able to be recognized for what it is. And bottom line for me, 90% of my projects, I don't know where they've gone. I don't know what they're doing, but they've changed from what I started them as, and the community has taken over, and the residue and what it is probably, I don't know whether you call it art or not, but I'm an advocate of the arts. I think women are really fucked over by the arts. I think it's a very patriarchal system, and we've managed to make our way through the art world as best we can. And I think I'm really grateful and privileged that I've been able to raise my 2 boys doing the thing that I love most, which is my passion for arts and people and culture.
Yeah, I can I respond to that, Gregory?
Of course.
Yeah, I think for me, it's important. It's always been important in all the work that I do to have a mentorship of young women and young women artists here in the community. Before I started, when I moved here and before we started the space, there was a very high rate of pregnancy among the women here in the high school. I know some of the teachers there in the high school, and I was working with one of the teachers, and we had a high rate of teenage pregnancy. And I started to see that a lot of the young ladies were not coming to the space, to the studio. And I said, why is that so? Started to talk with the teacher there in the high school, the art teacher, the lead art high school teacher. And I think for me, it was really important, and I had to do this intentionally, that it was important that there was young women artists, right? A mentorship of young women artists here in the community, and that was going to be something that I would set myself to accomplish, however long it took. And I think just if there was anything that I think that I could say I accomplished in having this space, I think I am immensely proud of how the young women, from the community sort of started blossoming, and they started to really look in the arts in terms of career, in terms of being able to even engage in their own practice, and that was such an urgent need here in the community. And I think about this all the time. Like, one time, we live across from the elementary school here in my house, and one time we were having some of the young artists and women and men sort of clean the yard, help us with the stuff, and they start at many different levels. The young the mentorship that we kind of engaged them with in the studio was, they would come to our house, they would help us pack, we would put stuff in storage. Like, it was very multi kind of dimensional. Then we would have them meetings with curate. I mean, anywhere from like institutional kind of like tasks to like menial kind of jobs, like help us clean this up. So anyway, so this young artist, his name is Spew. He was a graffiti artist, and he was in the front, and he was like sweeping the front of the house to help us get some of the materials that we were going to go transfer to the studio at Slangwich. And across the street, there's an elementary school, and the kids are out playing, and then they start playing. They had a band, and they start playing the American, what is it called? The American, oh, say, can you see the American? Yeah, American anthem. And they start like in the boombox, right? Like, oh, say, can you see? And all the kids are like, singing along. And the Spews like starts like, stop sweeping, as we're all like putting the stuff away. And he says, you know what? I could have been a patriot, but I chose to be a pirate. And I was like, what? That's who we are. What? We're pirates, right? It kind of clicked, like, in this kind of realm. Yeah, like, we're pirates, right? Like, it's like that kind of reflection of like, yes, we chose that, right? There's an intentionality behind that. Like, yes, we could have been patriots. We could have had like a bow tie and wore probably a gray suit. We could have had an office job, but we chose to be pirates, and this is how we're going to make it. And it just kind of made it really kind of evident for me, like, that, you know what, we don't know what we're doing while we're doing this kind of spacing of, but there's an intentionality, there's an aim, and hopefully that, with being this kind of, in answering to your question about how you're supporting artists, we were supporting young men essentially, but just being some of these young men and women, right? And especially the men, I was one of the first ladies, right, that they didn't see as a mother, as their sister, right? But that they really engaged with me in terms of like, and I wasn't the principal or a teacher really, I was more, an artist that was directing the space, that kind of having conversations in this kind of public space. And so for them, I think it was really important that there was a female kind of, a woman being able to say, hey, how do we engage in this space together? How do we engage not only with young men, but also with young women? And how do we keep supporting that voice? And for me, it's important that we give that voice and mentorship, and also have platforms for young women to support what they want to do. What do they want to see themselves doing? And for instance, I never been able to ride a bike. I never learned to ride a bike. But these young ladies, they wanted to do, for some reason here in Wilmington, there was never a bike path, right? It was always like, there was never a bike path, but the young ladies wanted to organize this rally of like, taking back the night and really organize a rally, riding their bikes. And they said, Carla, I want you to support us. And so they had the space there, they had their meetings, they had their you know, they rallied the people there and they said, but we want you to ride your bike. Well, I can't ride a bike. I said, I'll go there and walk there with my little flags and stuff, but I'll support you guys if that's what you guys need. But so for me, it's always been really important that we continue to have that kind of mentorship for young women, but also, you know, I mean, I think there was young men that were already kind of coming to the space, but I think my direction was very intentional for the young ladies, especially because I felt there was a need for them to have a voice.
Betsy, I know you said you come from a place that's not especially sociopolitical, but I'd still love to hear your feeling on raising up women through art, through soft power.
Yeah, I'm. You know, I've been thinking a lot as people have been sharing their thoughts, and I mean, to be perfectly honest, in my personal experience, I had a lot of difficulty when I was younger. I didn't believe in myself. I didn't have any confidence, and but art really gave me something that I could hold on to, that I could keep going with. And now I feel like I'm in a place where I am working with younger artists, especially young women artists, but all artists in general, and empowering them to keep going with their work. And one of the things that I'm noticing, particularly of you know, a group of artists that I've been working with, is how the young women artists believe in themselves more than I did when I was that age. And that I find to be hopeful and reassuring. And so I'm hoping that I can, what I try to do from my position in my own life as an educator, and as an artist, and as someone who has a small project space, is to give artists, emerging artists, opportunities to show their work, not only through my own space, but also projects that I've been doing with Flood, such as San Pedro and the Pump Festival we did a few years ago, giving artists who are coming up opportunities to share their work with the public. I think that's really important, to give artists an opportunity to connect with the public, because it's hard to do that when they're, I mean, it's easier now than it used to be. Now that we have the internet, it's easier to connect with a broader audience, but I'm still a big believer in direct experience and direct connection between people. So I don't know if that answers your question, but essentially, I guess I'm really impressed with the changes that have come about. And I guess I'm also keenly aware that I don't know if this is true of everyone, my own age group and older, but I still find myself investing a great deal of time in traditional female roles, such as caregiving, and doing a lot of labor that doesn't have the same level of prestige or recognition as maybe professional careers might have. So things such as caregiving and dishes and cooking and things like that that are, you know, traditionally associated with female work. Like, for example, right now, my elderly parents are needing extra help, and I have 3 brothers, and some of it lands on them. A lot of it is something that I am choosing to do. I don't have to do it, but I'm choosing to do it. And so I want to find a way to be present for the people in my life that are important to me, and also be sure to keep my art practice alive. So right now I'm trying to balance both, and I imagine I'm not the only female artist who's juggling those kinds of responsibilities. And I imagine there are other, you know, it's not just a gender specific thing, but I would be curious to know if there are other female artists who are also juggling that kind of thing.
And I definitely would not want to leave this topic without hearing what you have to say on this, Carol.
Well, it's funny because I think some of the terms are pulled out of my artist statement.
Yes, indeed.
And I was like sitting here thinking about Well, my work builds actually on the history of the Guerrilla Girls. So I was like living in New York City and coming of kind of in my early 20s, like coming of age as a young adult when the Guerrilla Girls were active. Simultaneously, I was reading the biography of Andy Warhol. And there was this moment after I finished reading that where, you know, he's defining all these people like Paul America and some other characters that were around the factory. And I was like, well, if Andy Warhol can make Paul America, I can be Carol Famous. So I was Carol Famous for a long time in the 80s in New York because I didn't like using my middle name, Francis, which I use all the time now. But so a couple of things within the context of the work, and some of it comes out of like attending Burning Man. The first Burning Man I went to, the Reverend Billy, who is the Stop Shopping Reverend, was performing at Burning Man. And I was like, well, it's great that he's telling people to stop shopping, but he's not giving them an alternative. So when the Sewing Rebellion came into being, the idea was that, okay, the Sewing Rebellion is going to tell you to stop shopping, but it wants to give you an alternative, which is to start sewing and mending and upcycling your clothing. And so the language of the guerrilla and the soft power also has to do with, I think in the 80s, there was a form of activism that the Guerrilla Girls were taking on that ultimately it fails because people are dismissive of it because of its kind of hardness. And so the way that I think about my work and this notion of a soft guerrilla is that textiles are this very approachable thing. It seems very benign, you know. Here's Frau Fiber sitting on a street, like at a sewing machine. It reminds everybody of their grandmother, and they all feel like warm and cushy about it or snuggly about it. And then they go up and they talk to her, and she then like pounces on them about the clothing that they're wearing and the way that it's made and how people are unfairly treated. So it has this seductive quality that then she hits them over the head. You know, when they choose to approach her, she's not a hawker. She is very soft, kind of. I don't know what material to use to describe her, but so that's those are some of the reasons why I use that kind of hard language. I think it also comes out of being like growing up a punk rock kid, you know, so it is like it's all based on this personal experience that has been filtered through, you know, the pedigree of my master's degree and understanding the history of art and understanding the history of feminist art and having some knowledge of that and kind of synthesizing and aligning myself within that canon very intentionally because I also want to be part of that canon. Like, I want the work to be remembered in that canon of feminist art history.
Marco, I see we've kept these people for about an hour and a half. How do we want to wrap up here?
Thank you to all.
Thank you to all.
It's simple.